Milk, gravy, and biscuits. Milk, gravy, and biscuits represented a slight step up from beans and cornbread, appearing at church suppers when flour had been donated or when churches had enough money to buy it. Flour was more expensive than cornmeal, about 25 cents for 10 pounds compared to 15 cents, but it made food that felt more substantial, more like real meals. The biscuits would be made in massive batches. Church women would measure flour by the pound, cut in lard until the mixture resembled coarse crumbs, add buttermilk or water, and form dough. The dough would be rolled out on floured tables and cut into rounds using biscuit cutters or the rim of a glass. Making 200 biscuits required careful organization. Multiple women would work simultaneously, some mixing dough, others rolling and cutting, others transferring cut biscuits to baking sheets. The assembly line efficiency allowed them to produce hundreds of biscuits in a few hours. The biscuits would be baked in wood-fired ovens, batch after batch, until enough were ready. The oven's temperature was unpredictable, requiring constant monitoring. Women would test heat by holding their hands in the oven. If they could hold it for a count of 3, the temperature was right. The gravy was made in massive quantities. Flour would be browned in lard or bacon grease in large pots. Then milk would be added slowly, while women stirred constantly to prevent lumps. The milk came from donated sources. Farmers with dairy cows who could spare a few gallons. When milk wasn't available, the gravy would be made with water instead, creating a thinner, paler gravy that was less satisfying but still made biscuits edible. Water gravy was an admission of scarcity, but it was better than no gravy at all. The gravy would be seasoned with salt and pepper. Though pepper was often unavailable, if there was sausage or bacon, it would be crumbled into the gravy, transforming it from plain to special. These occasions were rare. Most times the gravy was just flour, fat, and liquid. Each person would receive 2 or 3 biscuits with gravy ladled over them. The biscuits would absorb the gravy, becoming soft and flavorful. The combination was filling and comforting, providing calories and fat that sustained physical labor. Cost per serving, about 5 cents when made with milk, 2 cents when made with water. This was more expensive than beans and cornbread, but still affordable enough for regular church suppers. Milk, gravy, and biscuits appeared most often on Sunday afternoons when churches held weekly community meals after morning services. Retention, hook number 1, 5 suppers down, and you're seeing the foundation. Beans, cornbread, potatoes, and cabbage appeared at almost every church supper because they were cheap, filling, and could be made in massive quantities. But here's what made these suppers different from just feeding people. They were organized with military precision. Women arrived hours early. Fires were tended constantly. Portions were calculated exactly. Serving was orderly and fair. This wasn't chaos. This was survival engineered by women who understood that organization meant the difference between feeding everyone and running out of food halfway through. The next 5 suppers show how they expanded beyond basics when donations allowed. Stay with me. When summer provided abundance, vegetable soup appeared at church suppers in late summer and early fall, when gardens were producing more than families could eat. This was the Depression's brief season of abundance, when vegetables were plentiful and church suppers could offer variety beyond beans and cornbread. The vegetables came from donations. Families would bring whatever their gardens were overproducing: tomatoes, green beans, corn, squash, peppers, onions, carrots. The vegetables would arrive in baskets and buckets, sometimes in such quantities that church women had to work quickly to process them before they spoiled. The soup preparation was organized chaos. Some women would chop vegetables, others would tend the massive pots where soup was simmering. Still others would can access vegetables for winter church suppers, ensuring that summer's abundance would extend into lean months. The soup base was water and whatever meat bones had been donated, beef bones if a farmer had butchered, chicken bones if someone had processed chickens, sometimes just ham bones saved from earlier meals. The bones would simmer for hours, creating a rich broth. that would flavor the vegetables. The vegetables would be added in stages based on cooking time. Carrots and potatoes first, since they took longest, then onions and celery, then tomatoes and green beans. Finally, quick-cooking vegetables like squash and corn. This staging ensured everything was properly cooked without anything becoming mushy. The soup would be seasoned with salt, pepper if available, and whatever herbs were growing: basil, thyme, parsley. These herbs were free, growing in gardens or wild, and added flavor that made the soup more complex and interesting. The result was a thick, hearty soup packed with vegetables, each spoonful containing multiple types of produce. The variety was psychologically important. After months of eating monotonous beans and cornbread, a soup with 6 or 7 different vegetables felt like luxury. Each person would receive a bowl of soup with cornbread or biscuits. The soup was substantial enough to serve as a complete meal, providing vitamins and minerals that were often lacking in Depression-era diets. Vegetable soup suppers were celebrated events. They appeared only in late summer and early fall, making them seasonal treats that people looked forward to. The soup represented hope, proof that the earth was still producing, that gardens still grew, that abundance was possible even in the Depression. The soup also represented community cooperation. Every family that brought vegetables was contributing to the meal. The soup was literally a combination of everyone's gardens, a physical manifestation of community pooling resources. Some churches would can excess vegetable soup, preserving it for winter suppers. The canning required jars, lids, and fuel, but it allowed summer's vegetables to feed people in January and February, when fresh vegetables were impossible to get. Bean and ham bone soup was the ultimate in Depression-era stretching. One ham bone could flavor enough beans to feed 100 people. The bone itself had little meat on it, but the flavor it released during long cooking transformed plain beans into something that tasted rich and satisfying. The ham bones came from various sources. Sometimes a farmer would donate a bone after butchering. Sometimes families would pool the bones they'd saved from their own hogs. Sometimes churches would buy a single ham, serve it at one supper, and use the bone for the next supper's soup. The bone would be placed in a massive pot with water and beans that had been soaked overnight. The pot would simmer for hours, 8, 10, sometimes 12 hours. The long cooking would extract every molecule of flavor from the bone, creating a smoky, salty broth that permeated the beans. As the soup cooked, the small amount of meat remaining on the bone would fall off and distribute throughout the soup. There might be only a few ounces of actual meat in a pot that would feed 50 people, but that meat's flavor would be in every bite. The beans would break down during the long cooking, creating a thick, creamy soup. The bean liquor would be rich and substantial, almost gravy-like. This thickness made the soup more filling and satisfying. Churchwomen would fish out the bone before serving, picking off any remaining meat and distributing it carefully. The bone itself would be saved and sometimes used again for a second pot of soup, extracting any remaining flavor. The soup would be served hot with cornbread. Each person would get one bowl, a generous bowl, but only one. The soup was filling enough that one bowl was usually sufficient, especially when combined with cornbread. Cost per serving? About 3 cents, including the beans, the fraction of ham bone flavor, and the fuel to cook it. This economy allowed churches to feed large crowds regularly. Bean and ham bone soup appeared at church suppers throughout the Depression, becoming one of the most reliable and popular meals. People knew what to expect: thick, smoky bean soup with cornbread. The predictability was comforting in a time when almost everything was uncertain. The soup also provided essential nutrition. Beans provided protein and fiber. The ham bone added fat and salt that bodies needed for physical labor. The long cooking made the beans easily digestible, important for people whose digestive systems were stressed by poor nutrition. Cornmeal mush appeared at church suppers during the Depression's worst years, 1934 and 1935, when even beans were scarce and churches had almost nothing to serve. This was the meal of last resort, the dish that said, "We have almost nothing, but we're still here." The preparation was simple but required massive quantities. Cornmeal would be whisked into boiling water in huge pots, stirred constantly to prevent lumps. The mixture would cook until thick, like porridge, then be poured into large pans to cool and solidify. Once solidified, the mush would be sliced into squares and fried in lard or bacon grease until both sides were golden and crispy. The frying transformed the bland mush into something with texture and flavor, crispy outside, soft inside. The fried mush would be served with sorghum molasses if it was available, or just plain if it wasn't. Each person would get 2 or 3 pieces, not much, but enough to quiet hunger temporarily. Cost per serving? About 1 cent. Cornmeal was the cheapest food available, and even churches with almost no money could afford to make cornmeal mush. The dish represented rock-bottom poverty. Churches that served cornmeal mush were struggling, operating on almost no resources, relying on the cheapest possible ingredients. But they were still serving food, still opening their doors, still refusing to let anyone starve. Children often refused to eat cornmeal mush, finding it bland and unappetizing. Parents would insist, sometimes resorting to threats. The battles over food were common in the Depression, where children's natural pickiness collided with the reality that there was no alternative. Cornmeal mush appeared most frequently in rural areas where cornmeal was even cheaper because it could be ground locally from corn grown by farmers. Urban churches had to buy cornmeal at higher prices, making even this cheap dish sometimes unaffordable. The serving of cornmeal mush was a humbling experience for everyone involved. Church women felt inadequate serving such basic food. Recipients felt the weight of poverty, eating mush when they wanted real meals. But everyone participated because the alternative was hunger. When molasses made beans, special baked beans appeared at church suppers when someone donated molasses or sorghum, transforming plain beans into something that tasted sweet and special. This was celebration food during the Depression, a meal that marked occasions when things were slightly better than usual. The beans would be navy beans or Great Northern beans, soaked overnight as always. But instead of being cooked in plain water, they'd be layered in massive baking pans with molasses, mustard powder, and chunks of salt pork. The molasses was the key ingredient. It was cheaper than sugar, about 50 cents per gallon, and it lasted indefinitely. A gallon of molasses could sweeten enough beans to feed 200 people. The molasses would caramelize during the long baking, creating a thick, sweet sauce that coated the beans. The baking happened in wood-fired ovens with pans of beans cooking for hours. The smell would fill the church, sweet, rich, promising. That smell drew people to church suppers, creating anticipation and excitement. The beans would emerge from the oven, tender and sweet, coated in thick molasses sauce. They tasted like dessert, but provided protein and calories. Children would eat baked beans eagerly, not realizing they were eating the same beans they'd eaten plain all week. Each person would get a generous scoop of baked beans with cornbread. The sweetness of the beans contrasted with the plain cornbread, creating a more interesting meal than either would be alone. Cost per serving? About 4 cents, including the beans, molasses, and salt pork. This was more expensive than plain bean soup, but still affordable enough for churches to serve regularly. Baked beans appeared at church suppers for special occasions, holidays, community celebrations, or just when donations had been particularly good that week. They represented abundance in a time of scarcity, sweetness in a time of bitterness. The beans also appeared at church fundraisers. Churches would hold baked bean suppers and charge a small admission, 10 or 15 cents per person. The money raised would support church operations or be redistributed to families in crisis. These fundraising suppers were delicate situations. The people attending were often poor themselves, and paying for food felt wrong when church suppers were usually free. But the small charge was positioned as a donation rather than payment, maintaining dignity for everyone involved. When someone donated meat, fried salt pork and gravy appeared at church suppers when meat had been donated, usually salt pork because it was the cheapest meat available and lasted indefinitely without refrigeration. A 10-pound slab of salt pork cost about $1.50 and could provide meat for a church supper feeding 100 people when stretched properly. The salt pork would be sliced thin and soaked in water to remove excess salt. The soaking was essential. Without it, the pork was inedibly salty. Church women would change the soaking water multiple times, each time drawing out more salt. The slices would be fried in massive skillets until the fat rendered and the edges crisped. The meat would shrink significantly as fat cooked out. When the root cellar cooperated, fried potatoes and onions appeared at church suppers in fall and winter when potatoes and onions from the previous harvest were still available. This was simple food, just 2 ingredients plus fat and salt, but it was filling and provided calories that sustained physical labor. The preparation required massive quantities. 50 pounds of potatoes would be peeled and sliced thin. 20 pounds of onions would be peeled and sliced. The slicing took hours, with multiple women working simultaneously. The frying happened in huge cast-iron skillets or griddles, with multiple cooking surfaces going at once. The potatoes and onions would be fried in lard or bacon grease until the potatoes were brown and crispy on the edges and the onions were soft and caramelized. The smell would fill the church basement, savory, slightly sweet from the caramelized onions, rich from the frying fat. That smell was anticipation made tangible, promising food that would taste good, not just fill stomachs. Each person would receive a generous scoop of fried potatoes and onions with cornbread. The potatoes provided carbohydrates and calories. The onions added flavor and some nutrition. Together, they created a meal that was satisfying and substantial. The dish represented seasonal abundance. In fall, when potatoes and onions had just been harvested, they were cheap and plentiful. Churches could serve fried potatoes and onions regularly. By spring, when stored potatoes and onions were running low, the dish disappeared from menus. Cost per serving? About 3 cents, including potatoes, onions, and frying fat. This was more expensive than bean soup, but still affordable for regular church suppers. The relish that saved bland beans. Soup beans with chow chow represented an upgrade from plain bean soup, appearing when churches had jars of chow chow, pickled relish made from end-of-season vegetables. The chow chow transformed bland beans into something people actually wanted to eat. Chow chow was made in late summer from whatever vegetables were left in gardens: green tomatoes, cabbage, onions, peppers. These vegetables would be chopped and pickled in vinegar with spices. The relish would be canned in jars and stored for winter use. At church suppers, jars of chow chow would be opened and placed on tables next to bowls of plain soup beans. People would spoon the tangy, crunchy relish over their beans, and suddenly the meal had flavor, texture, and interest. The vinegar in chow chow also aided digestion of the beans, reducing the gas that came from eating beans multiple times per week. This practical benefit made chow chow essential, not just nice to have. Every church had its own chow chow recipe. Some were sweet, some were hot, some were vinegary. All of them made beans better. The variety of chow chow recipes created informal competitions. Whose church had the best chow chow became a point of pride. The combination of creamy beans and tangy chow chow became the taste of Depression-era church suppers. Decades later, people could still remember that specific flavor combination. Cost per serving? About 3 cents for the beans, plus negligible cost for chow chow since the vegetables were donated and vinegar was cheap. When the dairy farmer helped cornbread and buttermilk appeared at church suppers when a dairy farmer donated buttermilk. The liquid left after churning butter. Buttermilk was often available when milk wasn't, since farmers sold milk for cash but had buttermilk left over. The supper was simple. Cornbread would be baked as usual, then broken into pieces and placed in bowls. Buttermilk would be poured over the cornbread, creating a meal that was somewhere between soup and cereal. The cornbread would soften and absorb the buttermilk. The combination was tangy and filling, providing calories and some protein from the buttermilk. It wasn't exciting, but it was more interesting than plain cornbread. Each person would get a bowl with 2 or 3 pieces of cornbread and enough buttermilk to cover them. The meal would be eaten with spoons, like cereal. Cost per serving? About 2 cents. 1 cent for the cornbread, 1 cent for the buttermilk. This economy made it possible for churches to serve food even when donations were minimal. Cornbread and buttermilk represented making do with what was available. It wasn't a meal anyone would choose if they had alternatives, but it was food, it was filling, and it kept people alive. Free food. From every lawn, dandelion greens represented the ultimate free food during the Depression. They grew everywhere. Lawns, roadsides, vacant lots, churchyards. They required no planting, no care, no money, just the knowledge of when to pick them and how to cook them. Church suppers featuring dandelion greens appeared in spring when the greens were young and tender. Church women would organize foraging parties, gathering in groups to pick dandelions before they flowered. Once dandelions flowered, the leaves became bitter and tough. The gathering would happen over several days, with women and children walking through neighborhoods, picking leaves and putting them in baskets or sacks. A morning's foraging could yield bushels of greens, enough to feed hundreds of people. The greens would be washed thoroughly, multiple times, to remove dirt, insects, and any debris. Then they'd be cooked in massive pots with water, salt, and fatback if any was available. The fatback was essential for making the greens palatable. Dandelion greens were bitter, and pork fat mellowed that bitterness. The cooking would wilt the greens down significantly. A pot that started full would reduce to a much smaller amount of cooked greens, but the pot liquor, the cooking liquid, was as valuable as the greens themselves, containing vitamins that had leached from the leaves. The greens would be served hot with cornbread. Each person would get a serving of greens and a cup of pot liquor to drink or sop up with cornbread. The greens provided vitamins A and C that prevented scurvy and other deficiency diseases. Cost per serving? 0 cents for the greens, maybe half a cent for the fatback and fuel. This was the cheapest possible church supper, feeding people for almost nothing. Dandelion green suppers represented Depression-era resourcefulness at its peak. The food was free, abundant, and nutritious. The only cost was labor. The time spent foraging, washing, and cooking. Church women provided that labor without pay, keeping communities healthy when there was no money for vegetables. 15 suppers down, halfway through. And you're seeing something remarkable. These weren't just random dishes thrown together. Every meal was calculated to extract maximum nutrition from minimum resources. Beans provided protein, cornbread provided complete amino acids, potatoes provided calories, greens prevented disease. This was nutritional science practiced by women who never went to school but understood survival better than any dietitian today. The next 5 suppers show how they did it when even the basics ran low. When creativity became essential. when making something from almost nothing was the only option. Stay with me. Bean cakes appeared at church suppers when women wanted to make beans more interesting without adding expensive ingredients. The cakes were made from cooked beans that were mashed, formed into patties, and fried until crispy. The beans would be cooked as usual, then drained and mashed while hot. A little flour would be added to bind them together. The mixture would be formed into patties and fried in lard until both sides were brown and crispy. The result was something between a bean burger and a fritter. Crispy outside, soft inside, bean-flavored throughout. The texture was more interesting than plain beans, and the crispy exterior added appeal. Each person would receive 2 bean cakes with cornbread. The cakes provided protein and were substantial enough to serve as a main course. Cabbage soup appeared at church suppers in late winter when stored cabbages were among the few vegetables still available. A head of cabbage cost 5 cents and could feed 20 people when made into soup. The cabbage would be shredded and cooked in water with salt and whatever else was available. Potatoes if there were potatoes, beans if there were beans, salt pork if someone had donated it. The soup would simmer until the cabbage was soft and sweet. The result was a thin soup that tasted primarily of cabbage, with hints of whatever else had been added. It provided vitamins and bulk, but little protein or fat. Each person would get a bowl of cabbage soup with cornbread. The soup alone wasn't filling, but combined with cornbread, it became a complete meal. Potato pancakes appeared at church suppers in late winter or early spring when stored potatoes were soft, sprouted, and barely edible. Instead of trying to serve them boiled or fried, women would grate them and make pancakes. The potatoes would be peeled and the sprouts and bad spots cut away. Then they'd be grated on metal graters into bowls. The grated potato would release liquid, which would be squeezed out by hand. The remaining potato pulp would be mixed with a little flour and salt. The mixture would be formed into patties and fried in lard until both sides were brown and crispy. The potato pancakes would be crispy on the outside and soft inside with a distinctive potato flavor. Each person would receive 2 or 3 potato pancakes with whatever else was available, sorghum molasses if there was any, or just plain. Cost per serving? About 2 cents, salvaging potatoes that would otherwise be thrown away. Potato pancakes represented resourcefulness, turning ingredients that were barely edible into something palatable and filling. When flour ran out, fried cornmeal cakes appeared at church suppers when wheat flour was unavailable, but cornmeal was plentiful. The cakes were simple: cornmeal, water, salt, formed into patties and fried. Each cake cost less than a penny to make. 20 cakes fed 20 people for under 20 cents. This economy made cornmeal cakes a reliable option when church finances were desperate. The cakes would be served with sorghum molasses or apple butter if available, or just plain if not. They provided calories and carbohydrates, but little else. Children learned to eat them without complaint, because complaining meant going hungry. Cost per serving? Less than 1 cent, making this one of the cheapest church suppers possible. Milk gravy over cornbread appeared when there was no meat for proper gravy, but there was milk, either donated by a farmer or purchased by the church. This was a step up from plain cornbread, but barely. The gravy started with flour browned in lard. Instead of adding water, milk would be added slowly while whisking. The milk created a white gravy that was richer and more substantial than water-based gravy. The cornbread would be split open and the gravy ladled over it. Each person would get 1 piece of cornbread with gravy. Cost per serving? About 3 cents, including the cornbread, flour, lard, and milk. This meal represented the middle ground between desperation and adequacy. Not good, but better than the worst alternatives. And you're understanding something important. These last 10 meals weren't really meals at all in the traditional sense. They were survival rations, creativity pushed to its limits, women making food from ingredients that most people would consider inedible or inadequate. But here's what's remarkable. People ate them gratefully. Because church suppers weren't just about the food, they were about community, about knowing you weren't alone, about the ritual of sitting together and eating together even when the food was barely food. The final 10 suppers show the absolute peak of Depression-era church cooking, the meals that appeared when things got slightly better, when hope returned, when abundance was possible again. And dumplings appeared at church suppers when someone donated a chicken, usually an old laying hen that had stopped producing eggs. One chicken, stretched with dumplings, could feed 50 people when prepared properly. The chicken would be boiled for hours until the meat fell off the bones. The bones would be removed, the meat shredded, and the broth saved. Then dumplings would be made from flour, lard, and water, simple dough rolled thin and cut into strips. The dumplings would be dropped into the boiling chicken broth and cooked until tender. They'd absorb the broth, swell up, and create a thick, hearty stew. The shredded chicken would be added back in at the end. Each person would get a bowl with maybe 3 small pieces of chicken and several dumplings swimming in rich broth. The chicken provided protein, the dumplings provided bulk, the broth provided warmth and flavor. Cost per serving? About 5 cents, making it one of the more expensive church suppers, but still affordable when someone donated the chicken. Fried apples appeared at church suppers in fall when apple trees were producing. The apples would be peeled, sliced, and fried in lard with whatever sweetener was available, usually sorghum molasses. The apples would cook down, caramelize, and turn golden and tender. They'd be served as a side dish with beans and cornbread, adding sweetness and variety to the meal. Each person would get a small serving of fried apples. The sweetness was a luxury, a break from the monotonous, savory food that dominated Depression-era diets. Vegetable stew appeared in late summer when gardens were overflowing. Every vegetable that was available would go into massive pots: tomatoes, corn, beans, squash, peppers, onions, potatoes. The stew would simmer for hours, creating a thick, hearty meal packed with vegetables. Each spoonful contained multiple types of produce, providing variety and nutrition. Each person would get a bowl of stew with cornbread. The stew was substantial enough to serve as a complete meal. Bone broth appeared when someone donated bones from butchering. The bones would be simmered for hours to create a rich broth that could be used as a base for soup or drunk on its own. The broth would be strained and used to cook beans, potatoes, or greens. The bone's flavor transformed bland foods into something more satisfying. Poke salad greens were wild plants that required careful preparation. Picked young, boiled twice to remove toxins, but they were free and provided vitamins that prevented disease. Church women would organize foraging parties, teaching younger women which plants were safe. The greens would be cooked with fatback and served with cornbread. Cornmeal porridge was hot cornmeal mush served as a meal. It was bland and monotonous, but filling and hot. Each person would get a bowl of porridge with a little lard stirred in if available. Cost per serving? About 1 cent, making it affordable even for the poorest churches. Fried okra appeared in late summer when okra plants were producing abundantly. The okra would be sliced, coated in cornmeal, and fried until crispy. Each person would get a small handful of fried okra as a side dish. Cost per serving? About 2 cents, since okra was donated from gardens. Boiled cabbage was simple. Cabbage cut into quarters and boiled in salted water until tender. It provided vitamins and bulk, but little else. Each person would get a serving of cabbage with cornbread. Cost per serving? About 2 cents for cabbage that was donated. Bean soup with ham hock was the classic church supper, beans cooked with a ham bone until rich and flavorful. Each person would get a bowl of soup with cornbread. Fried potatoes were simple but filling. Potatoes sliced thin and fried in lard until crispy. Each person would get a scoop of potatoes with cornbread. Soup, beans, and greens together provided protein from beans and vitamins from greens. Each person would get beans, greens, and cornbread. Cost per serving? About 3 cents. Potato and bean soup combined 2 cheap ingredients into a thick, filling soup. Each person would get a bowl with cornbread. Cost per serving? About 3 cents. Cornbread with molasses drizzled over it was a simple treat when molasses was donated. Each person would get cornbread with a drizzle of molasses. Cost per serving? About 2 cents. Final outro: 30 cheap church suppers that fed entire towns during the Great Depression. These weren't just meals. They were proof that communities could survive anything when people shared what little they had. These suppers saved lives, prevented starvation, and maintained dignity during America's darkest economic hour. If you made it through all 30 suppers, you understand something important: that survival requires community, that poverty can be overcome through sharing, and that the women who cooked these meals deserve to be remembered. Subscribe for more Depression-era history. Next video covers the prices at company stores that kept families in debt for generations, from the church basements to your kitchen. Don't let them forget what our grandparents survived. Vegetable stew, when gardens shared their bounty. Every vegetable that was available would go into massive pots: tomatoes, corn, beans, squash, peppers, onions, potatoes. The stew would simmer for hours, creating a thick, hearty meal packed with vegetables. Each spoonful contained multiple types of produce, providing variety and nutrition. Each person would get a bowl of stew with cornbread. The stew was substantial enough to serve as a complete meal. Cost per serving? About 3 cents, since most vegetables were donated from gardens. Final outro: 20 church suppers fed entire towns during the Great Depression, proof communities survive through sharing. These meals saved lives and maintained dignity when cooperation overcame poverty. Which supper did your family survive on? Comment the meal name and location. I'm mapping these traditions. Subscribe for Depression-era history. Next, company store prices that trapped families in debt.